So this second presentation is the second part to our sort of unit on skill acquisition. What we learnt earlier is classifying movement skills. What we're going to focus on now is practice strategies and feedback that we can use to improve movement skills. If we want to help people as coaches to develop their skills and be able to give them feedback from their skills, we need to have a bit of an understanding about how learning occurs, and particularly in this context of sport and learning motor skills. So the model that we're going to use is a pretty widely accepted model in the physical activity context, which is a model by Fitz and Posner, which essentially divides motor skill development into 3 sequential stages. So they propose that all athletes, when they're starting a new skill for the first time, so a skill you're not yet competent with, we start in what we call the cognitive stage. After we've developed to a level where we're sort of at the end of that cognitive stage of learning the skill, we progress into what we call the associative stage, which is a bit of a stage of refinement. And then finally, we reach what we call the autonomous stage, which is the highest stage of learning for a motor skill. And as the name suggests, this is sort of when you get to the point where you're performing the skill without really thinking about it. It's quite automatic for your body to do that. So we do say that everybody commencing a new sport starts as a beginner, and as a beginner, you're in the cognitive stage. Some people stay in the cognitive stage. They don't progress any further, but most people that put in enough effort and stick at it might make their way through to the associative stage. And then those better athletes will make it through to the autonomous stage. Let's break these 3 stages down a little bit further so you've got a good understanding. Because one thing I imagine you certainly might need to do in a SAC or an exam situation, or more importantly, in a real life situation, if you are coaching a team, is you'll look at a scenario and get given some information about that scenario or make your own observations of that scenario. And you might need to work out what stage of learning a performer is in, because that will influence the types of things you get them to do to help them move through that stage. So if your performer is in the cognitive stage, this stage is essentially, and the word cognitive means that, it's all about the brain. You're mentally trying to understand what needs to be done. What are the movement requirements for me to execute this skill? And because you're thinking about it so much, the actual execution itself is probably inconsistent, so it's not always successful. It'd be stiff, unrelaxed movements, so it's not going to be fluent and coordinated. And you're going to make a number of mistakes. The performer is going to know that they're making mistakes, but they're not really going to know how to fix them. So they're going to ask quite a few questions. The benefit of the cognitive stage is improvement is really rapid, and improvement actually decreases as we move into the other 2 stages. It still occurs, but not as quickly, which is good, because if you're starting at the cognitive stage, for you to stay motivated, you're going to want to see some pretty quick improvement. Let's say our performer has progressed from the cognitive through to the associative stage. This is their practice stage. So this is where they're refining their technique and their movement so that they are starting to make it less rigid, less stiff, less uncoordinated. So they're starting to make their movement a bit more fluent, and to do that, it means that their mental attention is a little bit less than what it was in the cognitive stage. They don't have to think about executing the skill quite as comprehensively as what they were in the cognitive stage. So with that becomes a more consistent performance. So they're executing with success more frequently, therefore they're having less errors. We would say at this stage that there's some errors that the performer is able to detect, and there's some errors that they're able to fix themselves. But they're still going to rely pretty heavily on a coach to help give them feedback to still work on how to eliminate some of those errors. Also, because at this stage there is a bit less focus on cognitively performing the skill, It opens up some more attention to be focused on the external environment, so you can start taking into account things like opposition, or maybe things like manipulating the ball a bit more as you're throwing it. Maybe you're getting some spin on it as you're bowling, or some swing, that sort of thing. So let's say our performer's gone through the cognitive through to the associative, and as I said earlier, not all performers progress past the associative stage, but those that do enter a stage which we call the autonomous stage of learning. And by the time they get to here, the skill is quite automatic. They're really not thinking about their execution. It's just an extension of their body, I suppose. So they're performing it really fluently, yet they're hardly thinking about it at all. And the more automatic a movement comes, the better you come at actually performing it. Because once again, they're thinking about it a lot less. It allows even more of their focus to be on the external elements of the game. So you can start thinking more about strategy, about tactics, on how to actually improve performance. Their performance is really consistent. They can anticipate errors as they're occurring or as they're about to occur, and they can put in place things to correct the errors, on their own. But as I said before, not all performers reach this level, and you could be at this level in one sport, but you might not be at this level in another sport. I would say not too many people reach the autonomous stage for heaps and heaps of sports, but I imagine most of you guys in this class, you guys and girls, might have a sport that you're particularly passionate about, and it's quite likely you're at the autonomous stage of that sport. There's no denying that practicing something absolutely makes you better at it. So therefore, the more practice you do, the better you'll get at doing something, which is where that saying practice makes perfect sort of comes from. In saying that though, you've got to do the right type of practice, because if you're doing heaps and heaps of the wrong type of practice, you may not be improving. If you're doing heaps and heaps of the right type of practice, well, you're on a pretty good pathway to success. So if we're planning a practice session, which is really just another word for a training session, we want to think about the individual. We want to think about the task that they need to achieve, and we want to also consider the environment. And probably those three things we'll talk about a lot more when we talk about a constraints-based approach to skill development in one of our next topics. So if we're picking a practice method, things we can consider and that we're going to cover now is whether we're doing part practice or whole practice of the skill, how much practice we're doing, how we're distributing the practice sessions, and the type of variety that we're incorporating into each practice session. And we'll unpack each of those now one by one. One practice strategy we can look at is how we use part practice and how we use whole practice. So part practice is when we take a motor skill that's got subcomponents to the skill, so generally a complex motor skill this would be really good for. And instead of practicing that motor skill in its entirety, like a tennis serve, for example, instead of just doing serving, 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 we actually break that larger skill down into some smaller components, and we practice different components of the overall skill in isolation. So as I said, really good for complex skills and actually really useful for beginners. Whole practice is when we practice the skill as a whole movement. So instead of taking the tennis serve and breaking it down into its individual elements, your practice would involve doing the complete tennis serve as one movement. So when we're trying to work out whether to use part or whole, so as I said before, part's quite good for beginners. Whole practice is obviously good for people in the more associative, autonomous stage. But we also need to consider some other things. Not all skills, even for beginners, will be best taught as part practice. So we need to have a think about the complexity of the task. So as I said, part practice is good for complex skills, but it might not be necessary for skills that aren't so complex. We also need to look at the task organisation. So by task organisation, if it's the tennis serve, for example, that task is organised with a number of discrete skills organised into one fluent movement. We need to take a skill and have a think about how dependent each subcomponent of that skill is on the thing that comes before or after it. Because if it's highly dependent on the thing that comes before it, it probably won't make much sense to practice them in isolation. They probably need to be practiced together because they're so dependent on one another. So for example, if the forward swing of your tennis serve is quite dependent on how high you toss the ball, it might not be the best thing to just practice ball tossing and then just practice forward swinging. You might want to actually practice that as one movement, tossing the ball up and then hitting it. So the amount of practice is pretty straightforward, and absolutely we've got that relationship that the more practice to do, the more you improve. So number one thing to take away is that for coaches, it is really important to maximise the time on task for your performers. So the more time you've got them on task practicing, the better it will be. If you go to our setting that you're familiar with at school, a good PE teacher will have really smooth transitions between their activities. They won't have activities where students are sitting out for a long period of time because they know that students will improve more the more that they're hands-on and actually on task. If we have a look at these graphs though, because this is important, you'll see that on the left here we've got what we call the imagined learning curve. And in a lot of people's minds, we imagine that the more practice we do, the better we get. And I sort of did just say that before, but it's only to a degree. So the imagined learning curve is as time increases, so the more you practice, your fluency in executing the skill just continues to exponentially increase. The actual learning curve, this is what does happen, takes into account this concept we call diminishing returns. And that's a concept we'll talk about in its own right, diminishing returns, when we talk about training and training principles. What we see is as time continues and as a performer moves from the cognitive stage to the associative to the autonomous, because that is what we would imagine would happen the more you practice over time. So we start off in the cognitive, then the associative, then the autonomous. As time continues, fluency increases, and as we said before, when you're at the cognitive stage, you've got really rapid improvement. So we start out with really massive improvement, but then we get what we call diminishing returns, which essentially means the better you get, the less dramatic your improvement is as you continue to train over time. So by the time you're in the associative stage, your improvement, you are still improving, but you're not improving as rapidly as you were in the cognitive stage. So 4 weeks of training in the cognitive stage, you will have improved a lot more than the 4 weeks of training within the associative stage. However, at the end of the associative stage, you're still a lot better than what you were at the end of the cognitive. Then we move into the autonomous stage, and the diminishing returns are still having an effect. You're getting even better at the skill, so your improvements are going to become less and less. So once you get to that autonomous stage, even though you might still invest a lot of time to your practice, you will still be improving, but you won't be improving at an exponential rate. You're sort of going to plateau at a point. Practice distribution refers to when you're scheduling your training sessions. So we have what we call massed practice and distributed practice. And depending on which method you use, distributed is definitely the better method, but it's a really hard method to access and to make practical for the general population. It's sort of only possible for elite sports, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Biggest consideration when you're trying to work out when and how to distribute your practice sessions is the availability of the participants that will be attending your practice sessions. If they're available every day for an hour or two, then yeah, you could schedule training across a whole week and you might have 4 or 5 sessions distributed across the week. However, if they have jobs or they go to school or they rely on coaches that also have jobs, you're going to have less days where people are available to get together and practice. So therefore that might result in what we call massed practice, where you have fewer sessions across a week but they go for longer, opposed to distributed practice where you have more sessions across the week but they don't last as long. So massed practice is really common for your non-professional sports. You think of your footy training, your soccer training, your netball, your basketball training, athletics training, whatever it might be, swimming training. Sometimes swimming is a little bit different because you guys are crazy and get up really early pretty much every morning to do it. You got less frequent sessions in massed practice, but the sessions last longer. With that, because you're trying to squeeze a lot into each session, you are going to have less rest intervals between each task, and that's going to make it physically and psychologically fatiguing. Really common in non-professional team sports due to commitments. Distributed practice is the preferred model. It will lead to better improvements. It's just not practical for a lot of people, so it's common for full-time professional sports teams. It's shorter. Each training session is shorter, but they're more frequently placed across the week. Because they're shorter, you're fitting less into them, so you do have more time for rest intervals between different tasks, so that does minimise the effects of fatigue, which essentially creates a better environment for learning. With practice variability, so this is a strategy that you need to consider when you're planning a practice session, because depending on whether you're using blocked practice or random practice, sort of will influence the level of improvement, how fast the improvement will occur, how long those skills will be retained for. And really, you're going to be looking at your participants, your performers, and what level of learning they're at to pick a strategy that works best for them. So in terms of variability, we divide it into two categories. We've got blocked practice and we've got random practice. So let's say we're at a training session, we're at an hour-long training session. If we were structuring that training session to be a blocked practice model, we're participating the same skill continuously for a set period of time. So let's say we're tennis training for an hour. In blocked practice, we're blocking together our serving practice. So we have 20 minutes where we're just serving. Then we're blocking together practicing our forehands. So 20 minutes of just practicing forehands, but we're not doing any serving, we're not doing any backhands. Then we move into practicing our backhand, 20 minutes once again, 20 minutes of doing volleys. So every skill is blocked and you're practicing it repetitively for a blocked period of time. Good strategy if you're a beginner because it will lead to faster improvement. A good strategy also if you're creating a pretty closed environment. So we've got faster improvement if you compare it to random. With random practice, if we take that same training session for an hour, but this time we say we're going to practice using a random practice model, what you would do is you would take all of those main skills and instead of practicing all your serves at once, then all your forehands, you might go serve to forehand to backhand to volley, have a break. Ball might get fed to you once again, or you'll be serving it, and you might do the same thing. But you're not just doing serving, then forehand, then backhand. You're randomizing it. So you're practicing each different skill, almost in the order that you might use them in a game. And that's probably the key thing. It would be more closely resembling a game environment. And one thing that we do know is that simulating that game environment at training does lead to better improvement. So we'd say this is a good strategy for those in the associative and autonomous stages, but probably not as good for those in the cognitive stage. Their skills aren't quite high enough to add that complexity of varying up each skill. Lower performance and slower initial improvement in training. So they might take longer to improve their serving through a random practice model than what they would through a blocked practice model. But what we do find is that they retain that skill development for longer, and that's what our graph's showing over here. So you start at the same point through a blocked practice model, you've got this pretty rapid initial improvement, but then you sort of plateau off, and then after the practice period, you sort of don't retain that skill as much when you've stopped practicing. Random practice model, you're continually improving, but not quite as quickly as the block practice model, but when that practice period ends, you're continuing to improve. So it actually is a better model to use for your more capable athletes for more long-term improvement. I'm sure you guys have definitely heard, and you've already heard me say it quite a few times already, that you should train like you play. So training that most closely resembles the game environment will result in a better transfer of skills from training into the game. So that begs the question, and from the teams I've been involved in, they'd probably love this concept. Why don't you just play mini practice games at every training session? So instead of doing different skills and drills at training and fitness, why don't you just play mini games every training session? Because the mini game most closely resembles the training environment. That doesn't happen, and doesn't happen for a reason, because you need to take into account some other factors. So for a start, if you're a beginner, just playing a version of the game at training, it'll be hard for you to develop your skills. That's quite an open environment, and they're going to be benefited from making it a more closed environment. So you can reduce some of those factors of the environment that would be present in the game, can take them out of the equation while the beginner gets their skill level up. In that same sort of following that same idea, by making it a bit more of a closed environment, even for your more advanced athletes, they can start practicing different strategies and different tactics that might be hard to develop and practice in that more open environment that is replicating the game with an active opposition. And then finally, doing the same thing, no matter what it is, will result in boredom if you're doing it over and over again. So if you're just doing practice games at training, eventually you're going to get bored. If you get bored, you're going to lose motivation. And if you lose motivation, you're not going to train as hard and you won't improve as much. Obviously, simulating a game environment is more dangerous. So you would also increase the risk of injury at training. A better thing to do would be to definitely have some elements of practice games at training, but you'd be using different skills, different drills, different modified games that simulate components of the game environment, but still allow you to have a certain level of control over the environment. So along with our practice strategies to improve performance, another thing that a coach would employ to help develop a performer's ability to execute skills would be giving them feedback. And it's not just the coach that gives them feedback. A performer can give themselves their own feedback when they're executing a skill as well. And feedback is really important. You guys would completely understand the importance of getting feedback from your teachers on your learning and how well you understand things. And when you do SACs and assessment tasks, you're always pretty keen to get some feedback on what you need to do to improve. And it's really no different in the sporting context. So feedback is information that a performer gets regarding the outcome of a task that they're performing. And we do say it's a pretty crucial part of skill development. So there's sort of no rule as to how frequently you should give someone feedback. But what we do know is that early on in that learning stage, of the cognitive stage, performers really benefit from getting a lot of feedback. We also know that as performers move into the associative and the autonomous stage, we actually need to start scaling back the external feedback so that they're developing those skills to sort of identify errors and adjust their own technique without always having that external input. So we don't want athletes to become too reliable on feedback. So whether your performers in cognitive, associative, or the autonomous stage, You're still going to want to be giving them feedback, but you're just going to scale it back a little bit as they get more competent. What we're going to look at now is we're going to split our feedback into two categories. Intrinsic feedback, which is internal feedback. So that's the feedback that the athlete's getting themselves from understanding their own body. And augmented feedback, which is also called external feedback, which is the feedback that a performer is getting from someone external to themselves. So it might be a coach, or it could be just the results of the outcome of a skill that they're performing. So we've got sensors and we use them, and sometimes you don't think about it, but if you do stop and think about it, there's quite a few different cues that your own body can give you to give you some feedback on how well you're executing a particular task. So let's take tennis again. Pretty keen on tennis today. Not even very good at it. If we take tennis, intrinsic feedback is feedback that the performer is getting from their own senses. So they might get feedback that's visual, they might get auditory feedback, proprioception feedback, or touch feedback. So visual feedback you're getting is visually observing, does the ball land where you want it to? And if it doesn't, and it lands too far to the right, that's some pretty instant feedback that next time you need to try and aim more to the left. Auditory feedback may be a little bit harder to identify, but you've sort of got this sweet sound that a racket or a golf club makes when it hits a ball, or imagine a baseball bat hitting a baseball, softball, badminton. Whereas as you hit something and you hear this sweet sound, you know that you've made good contact. Sometimes, and I know in golf, you might hit the ball and you hear a bit more of a clunk than you'd like to. You know you haven't hit it very well. Proprioception is a type of feedback. So essentially in your body, you've got these different receptors and they feed information back to your brain regarding the position that your body is in relation to space, in terms of balancing, or in relation to different objects. So a good example would be surfing. When you're surfing, your body's going to have a feeling for when you're going off balance, maybe for when you're too close to the lip of the wave, or maybe you're getting too close into the barrel part of the wave. So we would call that proprioception, having an awareness of how your body is moving in relation to the space around you or an object. And then touch. So feedback on feeling that touch between your body and an object that you're trying to manipulate. So your tennis grip would be a good example. Your golf grip, once again, maybe if you're going golf or tennis and you hit the ball and it's not a great shot, and you notice maybe that the racket has twisted a bit in your hand. That's some touch feedback regarding your grip. Augmented feedback, or extrinsic feedback, or external feedback, whichever other word you want to use, essentially just means feedback of information about the outcome of a task, but that feedback's coming from outside of your body. It's not coming from your own eyes, or your own touch, or your own hearing, or your own proprioception. It's coming from something external to your body. External feedback is important. Generally, it's coming from a coach. More often than not, your external feedback, link this to a coach. The coach is giving you some feedback. But what the best thing it does, is it gives you a bit of a reference point to help calibrate your own internal feedback system. So, for example, if you're hitting a ball, what you want to be able to do is you want to align that sound that you get when you hit the ball and you know it's a good shot. You want to be able to align that to what somebody external to your body is telling you is a good shot. So you start to calibrate your internal senses with the external feedback you're getting. So you're sort of getting to a point where your internal senses are giving you a really good indication of your performance, and you're probably becoming less reliant on external feedback. we can split this feedback into two types. Concurrent feedback is feedback you're getting externally during the actual activity. So if you're a cyclist and you're in a race, your coach might be giving you updates of split times as you're going. So during the activity, you're getting some feedback. Most feedback is probably terminal feedback, and that's where you get some feedback after you've actually finished performing a particular skill. So you might have just done a golf shot, you might have teed off, and then you're going to get some feedback regarding what your swing was like. So with our augmented feedback, our external feedback, generally we can link it to knowledge of results or knowledge of performance. So with knowledge of results, we're giving feedback on the outcome of the skill or the task that you've just performed. So if you were intending on spinning a cricket ball when you bowled it, knowledge of results would be feedback regarding how much spin you managed to get on the ball. Knowledge of performance is feedback on your performance as you're executing the skill. So it might have been maybe how much you turned your hand as you were bowling, or it might be related to how fast the rotation of your arm was as you were bowling, or maybe the height that you released the ball. So knowledge of results is good for people in the cognitive stage when they're learning a new skill. And as I said before, it helps them to align their intrinsic feedback systems with that external feedback they're getting from a coach. Knowledge of performance, which I sort of just talked about anyway, is getting feedback regarding the characteristics of performing the task. So if it's that cricket spin, as I said before, just to emphasise, if you're trying to bowl a cricket ball and get spin on it, knowledge of performance would not be saying you need more spin. Knowledge of performance would be related to a characteristic of you as you were executing the skill. So it would be you need to turn your hand more as you're releasing the ball. This is the bit some people shy away from, and that's delivering feedback. So some people can find it quite confronting having to give feedback to someone else. Other people, like this coach down here in the velodrome, he looks like he loves giving feedback. Whether you like it or not, you can alleviate some of the stress about giving it if you follow a bit of a model that is sort of going to point out a performer's errors, give them constructive feedback on how to fix them, but also buffer that with some positive comments on things they're doing well. And if you follow that as a general rule, people will take your feedback pretty well. The last thing you want to do is have a performer thinking that your feedback's not genuine. So if a performer's doing a pretty ordinary job and you're constantly telling them good work, you're doing really well, pretty soon they're going to start thinking this bloke's just going to tell me what I want to hear. So the purpose of giving feedback to someone, obviously so that they can fix their errors, so that they can stay motivated, which is through feedback that is actually positive. So giving someone positive feedback is as important as giving them negative feedback, because people are motivated when they feel like they're improving. And if you're not giving any positive feedback and all you're giving is negative feedback, people won't have that sense of improvement and they'll lose motivation. It is easier, I think, to pick out what people are doing wrong than to remember to tell them what they're doing right. And I certainly know I had a particular footy coach once who would give no positive feedback at all, and it'd all be negative. His justification was that he doesn't see us that often. We all do things really well or we wouldn't be in that particular program we're in. So in the short time that he sees us, we'll benefit most from him telling us how to improve. So not as good for the self-esteem, but I can sort of get where he's coming from, though it doesn't follow this model, so don't do it. So fixing errors, motivating people through positive feedback, and then reinforcement through positive feedback, which means reinforcing when a skill is executed well, so that people are understanding that the way they did that is the right way to do it. Whether you're giving positive or constructive feedback, you need to make sure it's concise, straight to the point, not overly complicated. Needs to be perceived as being genuine. You don't want it to be too critical and just targeting the errors. You need to have some positive stuff in there as well. You want to give frequent feedback, particularly in the cognitive stage of learning. Frequent feedback will enhance skill development, but you don't want to create an over-dependence on the coach. So you want to scale back your feedback as the performer starts moving into those later stages of learning. A good model to go with if you're giving feedback to someone. So let's say it's a golfer, and we've noticed that their backswing was too short. And after we've watched them take their swing, we've known straight away that their backswing's too short. In our head, what we want to do is we want to get to the point where we tell them you need to take your club back a bit further in your backswing. Opposed to going straight to that, I would suggest, and when I say I, your textbook would completely agree, because that's where I got it from, that you start by giving a motivating comment. So say, oh, good shot, followed by some positive feedback. Your follow through was spot on. So good shot, your follow through on that was actually really good. But see if you can go back a bit further on your backswing. So you've given them the feedback, that's the error, but you've buffered that by giving them some positive feedback as well. That's a nice model. Probably one you will see given to you at your parent-teacher interviews.